Right. We can get started. It's with letting people keep trickling in. So welcome, folks. My name is Alyssa. My pronouns are she, they, and I am an organizer with Climate Justice Durham. And welcome. I'm going to be your host this evening. So glad to have all of you here. So just a heads up that we are recording this webinar so that we can post it for future viewing. If you prefer not to have your face in the recording, you can just leave your camera off, and that's totally fine. A little bit about Climate Justice Durham. We are a grassroots group. We do lots of climate action in Durham region. We're a multi-generational group, so we've got people of all ages who organize with us. And really, we're just a bunch of people who are concerned about climate justice. And we're really happy to welcome everybody for our very first Learning Circle webinar. It's a timely talk about climate change and you in Durham region, highlighting some of the latest scientific data, local Durham impacts, and our goal is to educate our community for action. So we hope you will learn something tonight that leaves you feeling both inspired and empowered to take more action. So um, if this is your first time participating in a Climate Justice Durham event, we're really, really happy to have you here. Feel free to let us know about that in the chat. And then there's also going to be an exit poll as folks leave, where you can also let us know how you heard about this event. So a brief land acknowledgement. Climate Justice Durham, while we're coming to you virtually today, we are active on the lands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. Peoples have inhabited for thousands of years prior to European colonization. These lands are known today as the treaty and traditional territory of the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake First Nation, Hiawatha First Nation, Alderville First Nation, the Chippewas of Beausoleil First Nation, the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, the Chippewas of Rama First Nation, and the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. We honor and respect these nations as rights holders and are grateful to them for their stewardship of these lands and waters that we hold so dear. As a group composed of primarily settler Canadians, we are aware of how our presence on this land contributes to the cycle of dispossession, and we are committed to doing what we can to stand against this and stand in solidarity in our fight for true climate justice, which includes Indigenous sovereignty and land back. Julia, could you go to the next slide, please? Just to talk a bit, some ground rules before we get started. This is going to be a respectful chat, so please be respectful, ask questions respectfully, or we might have to remove you just for everybody's safety. Put your questions in the chat, and Julia, our lovely tech support organizer, is going to be helping with collecting all of those tonight, so give them to Dan. And if you like a question, then just react to it with a little emoji so that we know which ones folks want to hear first. So again, Julia, our event manager and lovely organizer, is going to be keeping us on time and taking note of those questions as they come up. So without further ado, let's introduce our lovely speaker and one of our local climate heroes, Dan Hoornweg. He's our first Learning Circle webinar presenter. He's a member of Ontario Tech University's Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science. He's the Director of Partnerships and Industry Training and an Associate Professor in the Department of Energy and Nuclear Engineering at Ontario Tech. His primary research focus is urban systems, the energy they use, and the waste they produce, as well as community sustainability and progress toward local and global objectives. His prior work included almost 20 years as World Bank lead advisor on cities and climate change, and 8 years as Chief Safety and Risk Officer for the Ontario Technical Safety Standards Association. So welcome, Dan. We're super grateful to have you here.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I'm very honored. I'm being the first. Oh, I guess I have to reshare, don't I? Okay, is it back?
Yes, it is.
Okie doke. Well, thanks everyone. Good evening, and well, I guess most importantly, thanks for caring about climate change and justice. It's an enormous topic, and it's going to be a lot bigger, I think, in the future. Um, uh-oh. Hmm. Okay. Okay. So climate change, where are we? Well, climate change is only not only, it's probably the biggest symptom, but it's kind of like the planet has the flu and climate change is just one big symptom. And what's going on, I think, is really two, maybe three really big drivers on the planet right now. One is urbanization. The whole world is urbanizing, and that has all sorts of consequences. Canada reached the 50% urban in 1921, but the rest of the world didn't reach 50% urban until 2008. And the last region, sub-Saharan Africa, won't be more than 50% urban until 2040, maybe 2050. So that's what's driving all the wealth, uh, generating most of the greenhouse gas emissions, causing the friction between countries to a large extent, and that is still intensifying. The second big driver is demographics. We are getting old in Canada, and particularly. Um, the world will hit peak population likely around 2075, and we're already experiencing the impacts of that. So we see that um, Russia, for example, a lot of the the war efforts in Russia are driven by the fact that their economy is not growing. Um, we are going to experience that probably with China as well. China hit peak population and is now starting to come down. So those are big drivers that that will have major consequences. And then the other one I think lots of people talk about is this information, the age, the digital age, digital economy, AI, space sector, and then climate change is the big symptom, as I mentioned. And this is the first really big, wicked problem that the world has had to deal with. We're not doing so well so far, but I guess first question is, what are wicked problems? And they're really problems that don't have a solution. They are problems that we can optimize or try to improve conditions, but we'll never solve them. They aren't one bad person. They're not a Putin or a Donald Trump or a the oil and gas sector. We like to look for individual scapegoats, but that tends to be symptomatic of people. If you got rid of them, there would be others that would take their place. They're more like this. It's kind of like a plate of spaghetti, where all the strands of spaghetti are intermingled, and then we have to try and work on one strand. It's very difficult. The common factor about wicked problems is that it's really when you get three or more humans together, and you get all of the angst of being human and the challenges and the insecurities, wicked problems emerge. So um, we've all recognized that. We've said, okay, we know we have this big, huge, enormous, wicked problem, which really is the global economy is out of whack with the planet, both in terms of impact on the planet and equity. So in the before the year 2000, we came up with these things called the Millennium Development Goals. And there we were going to try and have these seven goals that were going to be achieved by the year 2000. We didn't reach any of those. We doubled down again and created these things called the Sustainable Development Goals, recognizing that it's all complicated and all of these kind of need to be solved together. And so we have 17 of these, and they're all supposed to be achieved by 2030. we will likely get one out of the 17 by 2030. We only have 5 years left. But you can see that climate change is one of the big sustainable development goals. So this is where we are from this whole urbanization. People in cities are really the problem. That's where all the money is. That's who's driving energy, material consumption. But arguably, city people in the cities are also the solution. Okay, this is an interesting way of just showing where we are on cities. If you look at 1950, there were 45 cities that had more than 1 million people. By the end of this century, some of you will still be alive, and there will be, what is that? That's 955 cities above 1 million people. So just think of that for a second, right? We've gone from 55 to 955 in the span of 150 years. Enormous amounts of energy, wealth, food, travel, everything that's going into those cities. Another way of looking at this, most of the world's economic architecture, the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, IMF, they were all created around just after World War II, around 1950. And look at on this list in 1950, um, Europe had 34 of the 100 largest cities, and North America had 16. So that's 50, right? And then another five in Australia, Japan. So the OECD, the Rich Country Club, had 55 out of 100 of the world's largest cities. And then just look back to 2100, Europe goes from 34 to 3. So, the expression skate to where the puck is going, right? We can see that Africa and Asia is where city growth is happening. And that's what's driving a lot of the geopolitical tensions that we're facing. Okay, this is another way of looking at Toronto, fastest growing city in North America. It was the 47th largest city in 2010 in the world. And even though it's the fastest growing city, it probably will not be in the 100 largest cities by the end of this century. It's just because it's being eclipsed by the other cities that are growing so fast. This, I like to have sort of a show of hands if anybody knows where this is, but I can't see you. So this is actually Buenos Aires. This is 3 blocks away from the current Pope's diocese. So the current Pope is the first Pope ever in the Catholic Church that was chosen from outside of Europe. And that's not because the Catholic Church became enlightened or whatever. It's really because the Catholic Church knows that most of the Catholics in the future are either in Latin America, or the next Pope may very well be from Asia or from probably not from Europe. And that's just because where the locus of growth is shifting to. All right, so let's get to climate change, because it's I would say it's the most visceral, the most immediate, and the SDG, and the sort of symptom of this global malaise that we have a pretty good handle on what needs to be done and what is being done. So this is the famous report 2009 by Johan Rockström, which is the planetary boundaries. So all sort of environmental scientists use this for the biophysical limits of the planet. And the idea is that we really should stay within the planetary boundaries that are considered healthy. So this is just 2009. But look at this. This is sort of every few years, the planetary boundaries gets updated. And if you see that in 2023, it got updated, climate change was broken into CO2 concentration and radiative forcing. And we are likely going to cross another boundary this year, or maybe early next year, which is ocean acidity. So this is, planetary boundaries, this is the sort of thing that moves in geological time, but in just 15 years, we've crossed an additional an additional four boundaries. We're really putting an enormous amount of um, impact, damage on the planetary biosystems, climate being a big one, but also biodiversity, nitrogen. There's a whole sort of suite of things that are out of whack. All right, this is and you can still go online. Fortunately, this hasn't been turned off yet in the US, but every day you can go online to the Keeling curve and you can see what the concentration of CO2 is in the atmosphere. This is an amazing data set. This is a guy named Keeling who started it. He died and his son has taken over. But every day they take a reading of carbon dioxide in Mauna Loa in Hawaii. Um, and this is irrefutable proof that the level of concentration is going up in the atmosphere from humans. This just came out last week, which is a bit of a scary thing. Um, the natural sequestration capacity of the planet has actually been was maximized in 2008. So from here on in, we're actually um, overtaxing the planetary ability of sequestering carbon. So that actually bought us zero point 0.3, which is a big deal, percent or um, yeah, part per million reduction, and it is now going up. So this is basically saying that the pace of planetary warming is going to increase because of this. It's a really important paper that just came out that's worth having a look at. Okay. If CO2 wasn't bad enough, methane is also increasing and increasing even faster than CO2. And that's another very powerful greenhouse gas. And that's largely from livestock and the oil and gas industry. Okay, this is just a big picture of it, or a big Sankey diagram showing where all, and this is a little bit old, but it's still roughly the same. Most of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy, comes from fossil fuels. But there's also agriculture, land use change, and then industrial processes like steel, um, cement. So this gives you the big picture, and we're now tracking this pretty well every year. I'll show you that in a sec. Okay, we last year, 2023 and 2024, we have crossed the 1.5 degree global warming. That's a big deal. Okay, I wanted to just show this very quickly. It's a little bit out of date, but I think this is where we start getting into this issue of climate justice. So that little pie of 2.5% in the middle is the ratios are roughly the same. But that's about 1.8 billion people who are low income people in the world. And the high income people, that's us, is roughly the same population, a little bit less, and we're about a little less than 2 billion. So we produce now, it's actually increased. We produce 51% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, the high income countries. And if you look at the right-hand side of that histogram, you'll see Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Mozambique. And why that's important, I think, is so this is a picture that I found a few years ago on Al Jazeera. This is a Betu. Betu in this picture is 13 years old, and he was taken out of school by his parents, as was his sister, to sell those oranges. And he basically makes 10 cents a day selling the oranges. And it pays his family to take him out of school, where they would have to pay school fees, to have a 13-year-old kid selling these oranges. So I don't know, and he lives in Beira, Mozambique, and you may have heard of Beira 4 years ago, was pretty well leveled. 80% of the buildings in Beira were damaged by a massive cyclone. And the cyclone was arguably, or not arguably, was linked to climate change. So here we have, and there's about 400 million Betus in the world, kids who still too poor to get an education, are taken out of school. So they're smart, but they don't have any education. They don't have much of a future, and they're going to get angrier and angrier at the world. Um, because they have been really given the short end of the stick in terms of climate change. They're taking the major impacts. We're concerned here in Durham, but our impacts are going to be significantly less compared to the low-income countries. So we have this incredible injustice starting to foment from climate, the impacts of climate. Okay, so now if we're going to get into the numbers of Durham, we just have to have your eyes glaze over for a second, and we have to do this this concept of scope one, two, and three. So in order for countries to decide how to mitigate climate, they've come up with this thing called territorial emissions, which is pretty easy. There's 197 signatories of the COP, the Conference of the Parties, and each country has provides annually and every 5 years with a better summary, a territorial emissions inventory, which just is all of the emissions generated within their national territory. You add all of those up plus aviation and maritime, and you basically get the total number for the world. The issue, though, was that there were a bunch of really enlightened companies that said, no, we want to figure out our total emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, upstream. So the stuff that we buy that doesn't takes place outside of our factories, and then the stuff that we sell. So they came up with this concept of scope one, two, and three to try and make sure you don't have double counting. So scope one is stuff that takes place in your company or your community. So it would be all the emissions from the burning of fuel. Scope two really is imported electricity. And then scope three, there's an upstream. So that would be, let's say, for example, if we eat meat that was beef from Brazil in Durham, the emissions that are in that embodied in that beef would be a scope three upstream. And then if we build a car and we sell it, the emissions that the car generates in the lifetime would be scope three downstream. And they all add up, and it helps to decide, the whole word, the concept, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we have a pretty good measurement. Now, the region of Durham, bless their heart, has what I would argue is the most comprehensive, probably one of the best comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Um, and it includes scopes one, scopes two, and very importantly, scope three. But this is if you just, and usually the emissions are late, they're about a year late. So we'll have 2024 later this year in 25. But you can see mostly transportation, industrial, waste, agriculture, and buildings. Buildings would be things like electricity use and natural gas for heating. Um, Pretty big numbers. They're, 16 tons, 17 tons per capita. Um, Pretty big when we know that we have to get to around two to have any hope for net zero. But where I think it's more interesting or more helpful, I would argue, to have a more comprehensive inventory. This is 2022, and just on the right is the Sankey diagram. Don't worry, you can look at that later if you want. But we have a more comprehensive inventory with the scopes one and two and three. And this is last year's, and you can see something big happened because we actually measured the scope three associated with the vehicles manufactured in Durham and exported. So we're following the global protocol, GPC, for greenhouse gas emissions inventory, so that the way it's being counted in Durham can be compared to any place in the world. But you see that things like what we build and sell or what we eat where we go. Cruises, for example, if we take a winter cruise, that's 2 tons per person, sort of thing. Those are the emissions that we're now getting a better understanding of just how complicated and how much of a wicked problem this is, because we like the jobs, but then we have to start looking at where are the emissions coming from that we have any chance of having any sort of impact on. So this is another way of looking at that. See the blue on that industry column, that's the emissions associated with the basically the vehicles being used down after they've been sold, automotive production. And I just wanted to show you something else here that is kind of an interesting, kind of a scary aspect, I suppose. Or not. Yeah. So in 2023, we had all the big forest fires, right? In Canada. It was the worst year ever for forest fires in Canada. In that one year alone, our emissions just from forest fires would have been the fourth largest country in the world for emissions. Enormous amounts of emissions. Other emissions that aren't included is, for example, we export a lot of oil and gas. Um, that would be about 24 tons per capita if we were to count that. So the emissions associated with the oil and gas that we export are actually higher than the emissions of the total country. So that's another way of starting to look at some of these big, really wicked aspects. And I would just kind of argue or plead with all of you and everyone out there that these numbers might be challenging sometimes to discuss or to think about, but until we start looking at the big picture and measuring it consistently, not trying to blame everybody, but trying to get a much better understanding of what needs to be done, that's what I think we need to do for climate mitigation. All right, so this is just CO2. Remember, CO2, that Sankey diagram from the start is only about 70, 73, 74% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. There's also methane in there and the other. It peaked, we hope, but now there's a big worry that with the US pulling out of Paris, that the world had thought that per capita greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2000, but that may not be the case. If they continue to go up this year per capita, that would be a problem. But I'm hopeful that they did. Um, this is just comparing other countries. Again, this is just CO2. But you can see, the United States and Canada, we're still a lot higher than Brazil and India and even China. Um, and that's per capita. And that's really because we're rich and we buy a lot of stuff and we use a lot of energy. Okay, this is the sort of the annual Bible, I guess, or the annual accounting. This is the one document that everybody working in climate change takes very seriously. UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, has been given both the authority and the task of coming up with what the annual emissions are every year. And this report is published usually about 4 weeks before the COP, Conference of the Party. That's always late November. And last year, and the numbers come. So the previous year's number are published in October, and last year, 2023, 57.1 gigatons, a billion tons of emissions. And it was a 1.3% increase. We have not reached peak greenhouse gas emissions yet. We are still rising, even though we know that we have to bend the curve down for any kind of chance of climate sanity, if you will. Okay, but there is some good news. Fortunately, it's a pretty depressing field sometimes. We know that we could reduce 41 out of those 57 gigatons within 10 years. That's pretty fast for just $200 a ton. And $200 a ton is not an amount that would bankrupt the world or really cause any problems for any of the rich countries. So we know that we can do this technically. We just don't yet have the public will. Okay, this came out early February. This is Canada's NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. Comes out every 5 years. Canada's actually making a pretty good effort of bringing the emissions down. We'll see what happens next government. Um, we're among the we have the hardest task, though, I think, of bringing down emissions, but they're heading downward in the right direction. So this is a document that comes out every 5 years. You can find it online all the time. Environment Canada publishes it, and I would just, yeah, have a read of it. This is the summary table, and so Canada's emissions are about 700 million tons per year, about 1.5% of the world's total. Last year, it decreased by 1%. Not a big deal, is it? 17.7 tons per capita. The number, though, that's a big one there, or interesting, perhaps, is this historical emissions. Remember, Batu, our now he's 16-year-old boy, man, in Mozambique, when he starts saying, hey, wait a second, I want some climate justice, he's going to be looking at historical emissions per person per country. And Canada's are actually pretty high, higher than almost any country per capita. So we're going to end up having to pay for a lot of climate reparations. Okay. This is from The Economist. Now it's about a year old, year and a bit. And really all this is saying is that Canadians are not the good guys when it comes to climate. We're not willing to pay much. We think it's a big deal, but that's really politically driven to some extent. People left of the spectrum politically think it's a much bigger, much more important than those on the right. So we're on all three of these. We're either at the third from the bottom or the second from the bottom. So we're not in good company. We're not the Boy Scouts when it comes to climate globally. All right. This came out just 2 days ago. And it's a really interesting paper. So we have this, we all know that in order to get significant mitigation for climate, we need to reduce we basically need to electrify everything and get rid of fossil fuels and make sure that the electricity is low carbon. And this report is really saying that all that we're bringing renewables and low carbon, even if you threw in nuclear, low carbon electricity, and we're increasing it significantly. Solar and wind are increasing faster than anything ever before, but all we're doing is running in place because the yeah, because we're not reducing the fossil fuels that are used for energy, especially coal, especially in Asia and Africa, Latin America. So the energy transition, there's lots going on, but we have not yet, as I mentioned, bent that curve to reduce emissions. Okay, mitigation priorities for Durham, we know them pretty well. Low carbon integrated mobility is what we need. It's not good enough to give everybody an electric vehicle. That's not going to solve our problems. It'll help, but not nearly enough. We're heading in the wrong direction with regard to carbon intensity of electricity, and that's because we're burning more gas. We're still designing most of our neighborhoods to be exclusively accessed through cars. We need to phase out natural gas for space heating. And we need to start looking at what we're purchasing and what we're doing, less beef, um, carbon-free flights, cruises aren't great, um, and local industries shift to lower carbon emitting products. So, for example, remember that great big number that we saw on our greenhouse gas emission inventory is because most of the vehicles we're making are big honking pickup trucks that burn a lot of fuel. That's what people want to buy. But once those become electric vehicles, that number will drop significantly. So we know, again, what needs to be done is just getting there. This is another way of looking at this. Um, what you buy matters, but where you live can matter more. You can see Toronto there that's the whole GTA, and the red is Durham, York, Halton, the outer areas, because the houses are bigger and people are totally reliant on their automobiles. Other way of looking at this, roughly the same household income. There's a East York. These are postal codes. That East York top left is 1.3 tons per person just for the residential emissions. Um, and in Whitby, different postal code, it's 10 times that much at 13 tons. Roughly the same kind of quality of life, if you will. It's just that that neighborhood in Whitby, you have bigger houses, more heating, and everybody drives. So we know what makes it. Okay. So there's oftentimes people say, there's no silver bullet, there's only silver buckshot, but there is something that is almost a silver bullet. And where we see that is in a good example is there's Atlanta and Barcelona, roughly the same size, same per capita income. Um, but Atlanta's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are about 20 tons, and Barcelona's are about four, a fifth. And that's simply because there's more people living in a smaller area in Barcelona, and almost everybody gets around with transit. So um, how the cities sort of sprawl out determines how much greenhouse gas emissions, to a large extent, they generate. This is just another way of looking at that. Our North American cities, Houston, Phoenix, Toronto, way over on the left-hand side, Hong Kong, Moscow, where they're much denser and people use transit, way less transport-related greenhouse gas emissions. But if you're going to go to a mayor, I would argue almost anywhere in the world. Um, so, for example, even in Toronto, to try and address transportation problems in Toronto, I don't think I would use um, lowering greenhouse gas emissions as my biggest argument, but I would use trying to reduce congestion as the biggest argument. In most cities in the world, the biggest driver of reducing cars is the air pollution. Air pollution is still the single largest cause of death, premature death in the world. And virtually no cities are meeting the air quality numbers. So and much of the air pollution in the larger cities, especially in Asia, um, and increasingly in Africa, are because they're still using coal for electricity generation. So coal is a four-letter word, but from our perspective, sprawl also comes close. Okay, so let's get into a bit more of this justice stuff. Um, all right. So why is there so little cooperation, um, and arguably such a slow rate of change in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Um, for Canada, I would say that we're not very good at collaborating. Collaborating between cities, collaborating between utilities, collaborating, and this might change with pressures from the US and tariffs. We're being forced to collaborate, but it sure did take a lot of work to do this, a lot of pain to finally force us to collaborate. We're also, I mentioned earlier about this peak population. Canada, for example, is totally reliant now. Our fertility rate is 1.3. which basically means if immigration stopped in Canada, we would pretty quickly become a non-viable economy within a generation or two, simply because we wouldn't have the rate at which we would decline is so significant that uh, it would be quite an impact. There's the US, there's the switch. I think this whole AI space economy and the rise of Africa is coming. I think people, not all people, but we have this selfish gene, and we tend to put up a lot of walls and a lot of barriers, and we're not really good at cooperating yet. I think we'll get there. Um, and it's hard. We know that we need an integrated, pragmatic approach, but it's really difficult to get there. Um, this is a great example. This just boggles my mind. Last week, President Trump withdrew all of the U.S. scientists from the IPCC. This is the scientific group that writes the reports on climate change. This, it'd be hard. It's hard to choose which one of the actions Donald Trump will be considered the most egregious historically. But I would put this in the top three. This is just stupid to pull your scientists out of such a rich global effort to try and monitor the science of climate. But um, climate change is one of those things that's serving as a catalyst or a force multiplier, but sadly, it's also a force multiplier for bad behavior. And that's why I think, it's so we're going to pull out of Paris is such a immediate attention getting thing to do that it sadly it makes sense for Donald Trump's approach. Also, these sorts of bad behaviors are not limited to the US, obviously. I mean, the fact that in Pickering, we no longer have council meetings public because the mayor and some of the councilors are afraid of each other. This is unprecedented, right? This just doesn't, it's not supposed to happen in Canada. It's not supposed to happen in our communities in Durham. But it's another example of the animosity, the visceral, the fear, the angst that climate change is driving. And we need to, I guess we need human nature. We're going to get angry. We're going to shake our head. We're going to want to fight with each other. But I think we just need to also sometimes take a bit of a breath and realize that this is kind of natural because it's such a wicked big problem that we're going to get some of the trucker convoy to Ottawa. We're going to get things like that. The U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement. That just we just want to shake our head and say, "What are you thinking?" But this is can it. This is it. Yeah, this is another symptom of sort of you've probably heard about the frogs in the boiling pot. This is a bit of that that's happening, and to see it in our own community like Pickering, it may scare us, but I think we should just be ready for it. Yeah. Okay, time for some good news. Okay, these are, I think, two really important books. This is the book that got me on the left. It shows you how old I am. I special ordered a copy of the Brundtland Report, that's Our Common Future, at the Guelph Bookshelf Cafe. Um, there was no Amazon, there was no internet, but it was the report that basically developed the concept of sustainable development, and it made it pretty clear what needs to be done. We haven't done it, but there was that's the book that created the Conference of the Parties. So the climate agreement, biodiversity agreement, desertification agreement under the United Nations, those all came out of this report. There was a Canadian named Maurice Strong who was quite instrumental in getting this thing launched. Anyways, this is kind of the start of sustainable development. And as I mentioned, we have the Sustainable Development Goals that are due in 2030 that we're not going to achieve by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and it's easy to give up hope and to feel, oh my goodness, this is just too bad. But I think there's books like Hannah Ritchie's on not the end of the world. We know what needs to be done, and we know that with pragmatism and maybe not a bit, but a lot of hope, we can get there from here. Toronto's a good example. It's a fork in the road. The Toronto Board of Trade came out with one of the most useless reports on congestion and basically said, well, we just got to make sure the lanes are open for cars. We haven't yet made the step to the how do we get around with much greater mobility. We need to start thinking like a region as opposed to thinking individual businesses or individual cities. This is a good example of why, transportation emissions in Ontario are still the largest source of emissions. So we need to focus on transportation, but not just making cars from internal combustion to electric, but focusing on integrated mobility. That's um, and 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 realizing that a complex problem is going to require some kind of more comprehensive, sustained response, as opposed to, well, let's just build more lanes or let's build a tunnel under the 401. Like what kind of, that's just, yeah, is not going to work. It needs a much broader response. So we need to think about a systems approach to transportation and mobility, ride sharing, um, and a bunch of things, transit. We did a quick study. I'll just go through this really quickly. The challenge with transportation in Toronto is, again, if you think like a city, you just, well, we'll just do TTC, or if I'm just worried about Durham, well, maybe I improve the GO train. But you need to think about the city as a region. So it's the GTHA. So you can see in those little diagrams there, that's 3 million people, just 43 kilometers across for the city of Toronto. That's easy um, to improve mobility in that area. But if you do it without thinking about the whole golden horseshoe of 10 million people, then you're just going to run into problems. So this is just the sort of the footprint of a bunch of different cities, and you can see bottom right there is the greater golden horseshoe. There's little Toronto. And if you think about it, the transportation systems are completely different for those two areas. And unfortunately, we have some people who only look at one, some people who only look at the other, and not nearly enough people looking at how do I come up with an integrated system. Okay, I'll just mention this very quickly. Um, a big tool that we have is biomimicry, nature-based solutions, another way we call it. And I just love the example. This is dog covered in burrs. And this guy, George Mestrel, created Velcro because he took his dog out for a walk. Velcro is just velour and crochet, one of those great nature-based solutions. And there's tons of them available for building better cities. Um, COVID is another thing that I think is worth mentioning. Um, COVID, we actually did have a pretty good metropolitan response. So we had good and bad. And these lessons, I think, are really important for how we're going to address climate change. Technology was really helpful. The Canadian Federation was not up to the task of COVID. We're seeing that it wasn't up to the task for these tariffs either, but we might be responding in a way. So we had each province had a different set of data for health, et cetera. Um, and then this whole anti-vaxxers that emerged from COVID is is kind of the same manifestation of things like, well, that we're seeing in uncivility. Um, so applying the lessons of COVID to climate change, this is going to be really hard, especially now with Donald Trump in power. We need new or enhanced or improved institutions. Um, we need a more collective voice for cities. Um, and we may be looking at, we probably will, I don't know how we're going to mediate, but we're looking at geoengineering. Cities, I think, are emerging more. I don't know if you saw today the what is it? The U.S. Council of Mayors passed a resolution today basically saying to Donald Trump, hey, you are overwhelming the city's ability to respond. It's just starting, but I think you will see pretty quickly the emergence of cities exerting their power on the federal government in the US to act a bit more sanely. We'll see how that works, but cities are becoming more influential because they're stuck with this whole issue of pragmatism. Last comment sort of on cities. We saw it again in the provincial election just last week. 80% of Canada's current federal government seats came from just 4 cities. So we have this urban-rural divide in Canada, elsewhere, everywhere really, that we need to address. So that's a big challenge. And then the last thing I would make, you can, I don't know where she is. Greta Thunberg is in this protest. I just think there's going to be more of these, and I think we need to be ready, and we need to figure out how to work together. But it's kind of easier said than done. Okay, thanks. And I would love if we have time for some questions.
Yeah, I think we
I'll
have
look on the.
a bit of time. So thank you so much for the presentation, Dan. That was great. Julia, have you been keeping track of the questions for us?
Yes, if anyone has any questions, please put some in the chat. But yeah, Chris, one of our members had asked, in terms of urban design, how much more density would make a difference in Durham? Is there any specifics about that, or like examples that we could look to?
Oh, great question. 2 cities that I love are Barcelona and Paris. And if you walk around Paris, there's almost no residential buildings that are more than 6 stories. We have this problem in Canada because of the way land development proceeds. Some company gets a hunk of land and then they maximize the height of the building on it because they're only basically thinking of themselves to maximize the yeah how much money or how much the return on that building. So we have um, we'll put in a transit node and then we're going to let somebody put in all these tall buildings, but they're not connected. We have not yet figured out how to make our cities the sum of the whole being greater than the parts. We still, the developers are only looking at an individual building as a part. So, yeah, so Barcelona and Paris are significantly more dense than Toronto, but they have far fewer tall buildings. They just have a much broader, more integrated approach to planning.
We also had, I see 2 questions here. I'll start with this one. Someone mentioned they're from Hamilton and they're talking about installing streetcar rail cars. Do you think this would be an effective transition to reduce congestion and emissions? Or do you think congestion may be maximized due to lanes being taken over by this project?
Oh, good question. It wouldn't hurt. It's interesting. So, the big fight in Ontario actually was rail cars that were in electric rail cars in Hamilton. Um, so, and what's it? Adam Beck was the guy who wanted to electrify and have rail connecting all the cities in Ontario. And he was basically overruled, and they ripped up all of the tracks for cars. Um, and I think sooner or later we'll probably go back. But it kind of is almost one or the other. Taking a streetcar in on King Street in Toronto doesn't mix well when the cars are there. And we also have lots of political opposition to transit. We've had problems in Mississauga. Bill Davis and his fight against transit in Brampton is just it's just sad. But so it's messy to get back to that. So I think it's an improvement, but it's going to take a while, I guess, is the short answer.
Sounds good. Yeah, we have two sort of similar questions. Someone mentions that how you had mentioned that, we have the technical skills that we know what to do, but we just don't have the public will. And then one of our members, Peter, mentioned, how do you think we can get people to work together better? Or like any other reasons you think we are currently lacking public will?
Maybe two ways to work together. So I used to work in Bermuda, and I was the government's one of the government's emergency response team did the waste management. And Bermudians do not get along. There's all sorts of racial issues and grumpiness and problems. And I was just dumbfounded at how difficult it was to get anything done. But then I was there when the island got hit by a hurricane. And it was a complete transformation. Everybody worked together. There were no union problems. I just it was like two different places. I think we will get there. And the question always will be, does it have to be so bad that we finally work together, or will we figure out that it's in our best interest to work more closely or better together before we get there? But humans are pretty good at working together when we have to. It's just getting more people to, I guess, to believe that we have to, but and not so much in doom and gloom have to, but that we're foregoing all these incredible benefits by not working together, I think is an important message.
Sounds good. We probably have time. Seems like a few more questions. Someone asked, is increased nuclear electricity production an effective answer for reducing the use of carbon fuels for heating our homes?
It is a part of it, but it's not a so short answer, yes. Real better answer is that it's complicated. The better answer is smaller houses, heat pumps. So for example, in Quebec, because electricity is so cheap, more than half of the buildings are heated by resistance electric baseboard heaters, which is among the most, well, not among, it is the most energy inefficient way to heat a building. It's like using a sledgehammer to open a walnut kind of thing. So yes to lower carbon electricity all around, but more important than that is building houses in a lifestyle that needs less electricity of any kind. So hopefully that's not a cop out, but
Sounds good. Yeah, we probably have time. This might be more of a statement than a question, but someone in the chat had mentioned like installing heat pumps and how that would help with Durham's infrastructure in terms of reducing emissions from buildings.
Probably, because there's a lot of natural gas is a big source of emissions. So for example, the heat pumps and geothermal, I think geothermal is also a good approach for larger buildings or collections of large buildings. Like the university is geothermal, and the college. So those two geothermal systems together are the largest in Canada. And they reduce, I don't know how many times, I should figure that out. But a significant amount of reduced natural gas. And the beauty of them is they also reduce electricity overall, because they're just as important for cooling as they are for heating. But yeah, heat pumps are great. I love heat pumps, and geothermal. And Enwave in downtown Toronto is a great system where the water is a heat exchanger for 360 buildings or something like that.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't see any more in the chat, but if quickly anybody else has any, please submit those. But Alyssa, I don't know if you want to move over to you to wrap things up and do our photo.
Absolutely, for sure. So thanks for compiling all the questions, Julia, and keeping track of all of that in the chat. So Julia wants to take a screenshot of everyone who came out today. So it would be good if folks could turn on their cameras real quick to participate in this picture, and then you can turn them off again. If you're not okay with that, you can leave your cameras off, and that's totally fine. But yeah, Julia, you can take it away.
Okay,
I
cool.
feel like I should be saying cheese or something.
Yeah, feel free to say cheese in your muted camera if you'd like. But I'll do a countdown. So, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I took that screenshot. Thank you for everyone for participating in the photo.
Awesome. Yes, so another big round of applause for Dan. We're really grateful that he was able to take the time and come and speak with us. And hopefully that you all learned something. I am going to put out a little poll that should let you leave some feedback and help us know if this is the kind of thing folks are looking for or not. And Julia, would you like to put up our announcement of who is going to be coming for our next learning circle?
Sounds good. Let me just share.
So our next learning circle is going to be on May 7th. We're going to be having Carol from We Go Food. She and her organization operate a lot of the community gardens across the region, helping bring local food production in. And so we are really super excited that she's going to be coming to chat with us about resilient local food systems. So definitely keep your eye out for that. If you have any questions, if you need or want to chat more about anything, if you want to get involved with Climate Justice Durham, you can find us at climatejusticedurham@gmail.com. But other than that, thank you so much for participating, Dan, and everyone who attended today. We hope that it was a useful event for everyone.